In 1972, when Apollo 17 astronauts Eugene Cernan and Harrison Schmitt drove their lunar rover nearly 20 miles across the plains of Taurus-Littrow, while most Americans had long lost interest in the space program, a few were still tuned in to the live telecast of the rover missions from the moon. On the evening of December 13th, of the three major networks, only CBS was telecasting the live video of Apollo 17 from the moon, or they were, until NASA suddenly cut the live feed for approximately 20 minutes, when something unexpected showed up on the screens of millions of viewers. At 5:48 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on Wednesday, December 13th, astronauts Eugene Cernan and Harrison Schmitt loaded up their lunar rover and departed from their landing zone and drove across the plains of Taurus-Littrow. After making several scheduled stops, at approximately 8:40 Eastern Standard Time, telemetry began receiving the signal from the rover. Operators on Earth started panning the camera to obtain a panorama of the terrain. The camera had a 4-second delay due to the distance from the Earth to the moon, and the camera was controlled solely by operators from Earth. As the camera panned past the astronaut in front of the rover, it suddenly revealed a huge rectangular structure in the distance between the rover and the horizon. The structure was smooth, box-like, and seemingly comprised of the same lunar regolith that constituted the so-called soil of the moon. Cronkite and his co-host were stunned, Cronkite exclaiming, "That looks like a man-made object." Then just as suddenly, the live feed was cut, as was Cronkite, replaced with footage with a graphic that stated, "Recorded earlier today." When Cronkite returned 20 minutes later, he was seemingly amused, saying that apparently the camera on the lunar rover had taken a picture of itself, thus the look of a man-made object. Then the live video coverage of EVA-3 continued, with no further mention of this incident in the telecast, nor apparently in any recorded document ever. There are several important points to note. Number 1. The reflectivity of the moon is approximately 7%, what is referred to as albedo, and indeed this immense object had the same reflectivity as the lunar soil. The lunar rover, on the other hand, was comprised of highly reflective gold Kapton foil, orange fenders, and other lightweight material which was orders of magnitude brighter than the surrounding lunar regolith. Number 2. There was no object or module on the rover which remotely resembled this huge rectangular structure, nor does that given explanation take into account the depth of field of the shot, which was a smooth pan from the astronaut to the horizon. Number 3. There was no part of the rover that was forward of the television camera apart from the high-gain antenna above it, and only the empty seats of the rover to the rear, which resembled lightweight beach chairs. Number 4. If NASA knew what every weld and gleaming inch of Kapton foil looked like on the lunar rover, then why cut the live feed? And why did CBS cut Walter Cronkite for 20 minutes? Number 5. And why is there no mention of this live misidentification in any document? Why does no air check of the telecast with Cronkite exist? We checked. And why is there no mention of this incident anywhere on the internet, which is rife with conspiracy theories? Even if the mysterious box-like object was on the rover itself, which it was not by virtue of the depth of field and relatively low albedo of the object, the incident on live TV should have been construed as perhaps the greatest broadcasting blunder of all time. Think about it, and just imagine the headlines. Walter Cronkite identifies alien structure on the moon, or Walter Cronkite mistakenly identifies lunar rover as alien structure. Either way, it's a major story, especially given the extraordinary context. Now, let us examine a recent Disclosure Project video from Larry Warren, a former soldier with top-secret clearance, who was one of the many witnesses to the infamous Bentwaters incident, also known as the Rendlesham Forest incident, which occurred over several nights at RAF Bentwaters in England in December of 1980. And listen closely when Larry speaks of the Apollo portion of the film.
we were shown a film, and they ran the film. I mean, it was just a film on a reel. It was non-narration. He did not narrate it. It began with gun camera footage, what I can only assume from maybe the 40s. It showed some aircraft, prop-driven aircraft, broad daylight. Looked like Florida Keys with a fleet of silver disco under it, broad daylight, like the movie camera was coming out of the canopy. That was one of the first frames. The clip changes. This thing went all the way up to the space program, and I swear to God, it showed structures on the moon, these box kind of things that looked sand-colored. It showed that lunar car moving around. I remember those clearly because I remember being a child when all that was happening, but them at a distance pointing, astronauts pointing at these box-looking things, structured objects moving off the surface of the moon, filmed by definite Apollo missions. And
what did the structures coming off the moon look like? What shape?
The structures on, and I know this is the moon because it was the Apollo era, looked like a continuation of the color of the moon, but they were structured to it like huge box kind of things, very square and angular structures without windows or any kind of thing like that, but they were artificial, clearly. And they were being filmed in gray, and then when there were lights and weird things on top of hills,
were they in good condition or old?
Oh yeah, no, they looked pristine.
And were
they looked like giant
moving, any UFOs moving?
Very clearly in different scenes, where a lot of it was with the lunar car.
One more time. Listen closely again to the last words Larry mentions as he's being cut off by the interviewer. Larry says they look like giant shoeboxes.
And were
they look like giant
moving, any UFOs moving?
Very clearly.
In researching this story, we were contacted by two individuals, both with science degrees from prestigious universities, to draw what they also saw on CBS that December day long ago. They have asked to not be identified in this story. Here are their pictures. Now, here are their pictures with some artistic license to indicate the blackness of the lunar sky and gray regolith. While the objects are certainly not identical, they are similar enough to indicate that indeed these witnesses were not observing any object on the lunar rover, but rather of something else entirely, perhaps even something decidedly alien. And just where are these video recordings now? At the Washington National Records Center in Suitland, Maryland, there are over 4 million decaying boxes of tax records, Life magazines, and for a time, all of the tapes from the Apollo missions. However, between 1979 and 1985, 140,000 tapes from the Apollo era had been checked out of the Record Center and sent to the Goddard Space Flight Center. But from there, the trail disappears. At Goddard, there is no record of the Apollo mission recordings ever being archived or even arriving. Concerning this dilemma, NASA has claimed that many of these recordings were degaussed, a technical term meaning they were simply erased. Of course, by NASA saying that these tapes no longer exist, that removes them from any legal obligations of the Freedom of Information Act. And what about any home recordings? Though video recorders were invented in 1956 by Ampex Corporation, unfortunately, the first consumer model, the Philips 1500, was not released until after the completion of the Apollo program. So no home recordings exist of this or any telecast from the moon. Let's look again at a brief section of Larry Warren's video and listen closely to the Apollo section of Larry's tape.
The space program, it showed, and I swear to God, it showed structures on the moon, these box kind of things that looked sand-colored. It showed that lunar car moving around. I remember those clearly because I remember being a child when all that was happening, but them at a distance pointing, astronauts pointing at these box-looking things, structured objects moving off the surface of the moon, filmed by definite Apollo missions.
Larry mentions that the lunar rover was driving around. As the only television camera was mounted on the front of the rover, the only possible way Larry could have seen what he described is if he was watching a film shot by one of the astronauts. Consider this possibility. When the live feed from Apollo 17's EVA-3 was cut for 20 minutes, that gave astronauts time and opportunity to use the handheld 16mm Mauer data acquisition film camera, moving at 6 to 24 frames per second, to document the extraordinary object or objects they were seeing. If indeed Larry Warren is telling the truth, then this was probably the section of the film shown to him and others at Bentwaters, as it also included the rover in the shot, which again would not have been possible with the rover's onboard video camera. NASA has stated that many of the Apollo-era video recordings were erased or simply recorded over as a cost-cutting measure. However, by virtue of Larry Warren's testimony, the film from the 16mm Mauer DAC camera, also known as DAT camera, apparently still exists and is used by the NSA, the Office of Naval Intelligence, or by an as yet unknown branch of the American government, to help soldiers like Larry Warren better understand the scope and immensity of what they may have just witnessed. So let's talk about that film, or rather the film cartridges, also called magazines. The Mauer 16mm data acquisition camera was specifically designed to use film magazines, which could be quickly changed by the gloved hands of astronauts. All magazines were carefully cataloged before leaving Earth, and also upon returning to Earth. However, there's a curious lack of footage taken on the lunar surface by the crew of Apollo 17. Of the 13 film magazines used by Apollo 17, only one was actually footage taken by the crew on the surface of the moon. Magazine P, moving at 6 frames per second. Ostensibly, there was also magazine JJ, but the only information on this film magazine was that it was unused and is therefore not available from the NSSDC, the National Space Science Data Center. For comparison, Apollo 16 shot 6 magazines of 16mm film on the surface of the moon with 1 unused magazine. Now, submitted for your consideration is a brief review of the possible events during the 20-minute interruption of the CBS broadcast, Apollo 17 EVA-3 between stations 6 and 9, December 13, 1972. This based on the testimony of our 2 witnesses and on Larry Warren's Disclosure Project video. When Cernan parked the rover near the shadows of the so-called Sculptured Hills south of Wessex Clef and 4 kilometers northeast of the lunar module, the front of the rover and the camera were pointed 90 degrees away from the astounding scene the astronauts were witnessing. With telemetry restored, and before astronauts could warn them, ground control in Houston began panning the video camera and stopped cold on the astounding object, now being televised all over America. Seconds later, the live feed was cut. As NASA cut the live feed, that gave Mission Commander Eugene Cernan the opportunity to reposition the lunar rover, possibly facing 180 degrees away from the structure, such that the astronauts could perform their scheduled EVA-3, then realign the high-gain antenna to resume the live video. At the same time, Harrison Schmitt documented the event with the 16mm Mauer data acquisition film camera, capturing images of the rover moving in the shot, Cernan at the rover controls in the left-hand seat, and the anomalous lunar structure seen behind the rover. Though this summary is conjecture, the commanders for the Apollo missions 15 through 17 were always the drivers of the lunar rover. So, if Larry Warren's account is accurate, Cernan was the driver, and as Larry Warren described seeing the rover in motion, by simple deduction we know that Harrison Schmitt would have shot the 16mm film, a section of which was purportedly shown at RAF Bentwaters. And just a word about NASA. In no way is this report intended to indict NASA for their actions or inactions, nor to point blame at any astronaut nor engineer. These were the true American heroes and pioneers of the 60s and 70s. And neither are we saying that Walter Cronkite was part of some sort of cosmic conspiracy. He probably believed exactly what NASA was telling him. And why wouldn't he? If the revered institution of NASA had the formidable technical prowess to put men on the moon, then it can also recognize a module on the rover down to 1/100 of a centimeter. End of story.